talk about how I think technology is going to disrupt the kinds of food, or the ways we produce food, and start by taking you on a little bit of a trip down memory lane. This is me. I guess I should use this slide because you can't really see that one. This is me sitting on my grandfather's lap. It's probably around 1975. It's my brother Nick, my cousin Dave, my other cousin Ian, and it was probably a rainy March break morning. The reason I'm showing you this picture isn't just to indulge myself, although I'm clearly doing that. It's to tell you a story of how we used to fertilize on this farm. And as a teenager, I would spend hours on the back of this tractor, on that platform, and I would have two big pails of fertilizer pellets on my left and right. And Grandpa would drive slowly through the sweet corn, the melons, the strawberries, and I would just do this. I would throw handfuls of nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus off the back of the tractor. Now, with the benefit of hindsight and a PhD in agriculture, I'm going to estimate that half of that fertilizer I threw didn't land in the right place or at the right time for a plant to utilize it. It just simply didn't. It either worked its way into the water table and then got into Lake Erie, where it's probably right now creating algae, or it worked its way into the greenhouse, up into the atmosphere as some sort of nitrous oxide, where it right now is acting as a greenhouse gas. Right, so that was what we did in the 1980s and 90s on this farm. But of course, technology is far more efficient at spreading fertilizer than teenagers. This is the new Case International Harvester tractor. It is a smart tractor. It knows where it is in the field at all times and puts the right seed in the right place and gives it the right amount of fertilizer. What isn't on this tractor? There's no cab. It's an autonomous vehicle. Farmers have been using autonomous vehicles for 10 years. This is because with this set of technologies, the tractor doesn't see the field, and I use the word see loosely. The tractor doesn't see the field as a field, it sees it as a series of management units. Using data and analytics and precision GPS and what's called variable application rate fertilizers, it can actually change its management practices as it moves from one management zone into the other. And as a consequence of this, tractors are allowing farmers to become far more efficient with their resources. So a shout out to a couple of my colleagues. Madura Nand led this project, Clarence Wanton and Aaron Berg are the other colleagues. We've actually taken data from these smart tractors and generated heat maps like this one. So this is a soybean field not far from where I live. The red areas show areas where the value of the soybeans was less than the cost of the inputs. In other words, the farmer lost money on every single one of these red squares. They made money on all these green and yellow squares. Now, this was a crappy year for soybeans, so this is a very red map. But it's dramatic, so that's why I used it. Once we've got this sort of technology calibrated properly, we can help farmers sort of say, all right, well, this square here is predictably losing us money. Maybe we could just not fertilize that area. Or maybe we could take this strip here that's always losing money and we could just plant it to wildflowers and stop seeding it entirely. Maybe we could generate the same level of profit while actually reducing the amount of inputs we're using. And that's where the technology is headed. We're not there yet, but that's where the technology is headed, why I get kind of excited. Similar thing is happening in the dairy industry and other parts of the livestock industry. What you've got in this slide is a robotic dairy facility, a robotic milker. Twice a day, the cow walks in there, lasers sort of shine on her udder, the arms come out and attach the cups on to the teats, and she's milked. While she's being milked, she gets a treat. It is an extremely impressive system in many regards. The machines themselves monitor things like temperature, connectivity, take samples, and they can identify things like mastitis in this animal before she even knows she's sick, let alone the farmer observes she's sick. So you could take an issue like mastitis on a herd and actually treat it with a fraction of the antibiotics and much more proactively. Similar things are happening at the genetic level, where we're becoming much more precise in our breeding. So this is a colleague of mine, her name's Bonnie Millard. She's had a career of breeding both beef and dairy cows to be more robust in terms of immune systems and more resilient to climate change, able to produce under hotter conditions. And so my sense here is that there's a tremendous number of technologies which are unfolding right now which are changing how farmers are operating. And it's allowing them to produce more food on less land with fewer inputs. And I think that will ultimately be a good thing, although, like I said, I'll come back to in a few minutes, it will have consequences that we might not all agree with. I think there's also big changes coming down on what we're going to eat. And in particular, my prediction here is that if we jump forward 30 years, the types of protein that you and I might sit down to on a daily basis will be radically different. And the first and most obvious change is I think we're going to eat more farmed salmon. And the reason I say that is that salmon can be produced with much less energy than other forms of livestock. And if you move farmed salmon into a pond that's inland, then my prediction, and again we have to have the debate about the trade-offs, but my prediction is we'll see more things like farmed salmon. But I think farmed salmon is the least alternative of the alternative protein coming. For instance, here we have what's called benevolent bacon, because it contains absolutely no bacon. It's a soy product made by the company Sweet Earth. Sweet Earth was bought last year by food giant Nestle. In Canada, our largest meat processor, Maple Leaf, has just made big investments in plant-based protein and is now making a meatless Impossible Burger that apparently will be commercially available in a couple months and will sizzle just like a regular hamburger. President's Choice is one of Canada's largest brands. Here they have a product that they released last year, cricket powder. They can't keep it on the shelves. Demand is far greater than supply. And each of these proteins, for one way or another, can be produced with environmental benefits, or less environmental costs than, say, pigs, chickens, or cows can do. For instance, we've got legume-based proteins. We've got the emergence of fungus-based proteins, often typified by this company called corn. This is an algae-based protein that's a sports drink, and of course we've got edible insects. And each of these, like I said, can be produced with environmental benefits. Crickets themselves require 12 times less feed and 13 times less water to produce than cattle do. This is according to a friend of mine who works on edible insects at the University of British Columbia. Pigs produce somewhere between 10 and 100 times more greenhouse gas emissions per edible kilogram, as does mealworm. And according to corn's website, corn causes 5 times less greenhouse gas emissions than beef and 1.5 times less than chicken. But does this mean that, say, in Super Bowls in the future, we're all going to be saying no to beef jerky and hello to the original cheddar cheese larvette worm snack? This particular worm snack was a little salty and dry for my taste. So I don't think the beef industry has anything to worry about this year. However, there are a bunch of places where things like this are coming on the market in potentially disruptive ways. First of all, especially getting back to the farmed salmon issue, increasingly people are looking to insects to feed salmon or chickens, as opposed to feeding them fish meal or soybeans, and deriving significant environmental benefits that way. But here's a cricket bar. Here is a protein bar made with crickets that I bought in the Ronald Reagan International Airport last March on my way out of the terminal. It was a perfectly normal protein bar. Nothing exceptional about it at all, except for the fact that the label claims it was made with cricket flour. And here I think we have to realize that there is a whole lot of interesting, possibly disgusting stuff happening at the food science end of our food system. What we've got in this slide is a 3D printer designed to extrude alternative protein pastes. I read this article in Popular Mechanics a couple years ago, and I just love the quotation that went with it. The guy that invented this said the following: "The look of the worms put me off, but in the shape of a cookie, I'll eat it." And for those of you who are highly skeptical, and I encourage you to be highly skeptical that the future is all bug pate for as far as the eye can see, let me take you on another trip down memory lane. This time I can date it with some precision. It was early December 1986. And I was 13 years old, and I was staying up late watching my favorite TV show, Saturday Night Live. And in 1986, Saturday Night Live was still doing those mock commercials. And they did a mock commercial for a new kind of food that I, a middle-class 13-year-old Canadian, had never heard of. but it seemed disgusting and kind of hilarious. And the food that they introduced to me was sushi, or McSushi. America's eating it raw. And to me in 1986, this was disgusting and hilarious. But of course, by 1996, California McDonald's were selling McSushi. And things had changed. Palates had shifted. So here's two photographs to suggest that maybe our love of chops and nuggets and burgers and steaks isn't quite as immutable as we might think. On the right-hand side is a young woman. This is my Grand Challenge class here, that kind of analogous to what you teach. She's just done a project on alternative proteins, and there are cricket flour brownies she's handing out to the class. And on the left-hand side, Lloyd Longfield's our member of parliament. The two young women are also from another year of my Grand Challenge class, and they have just, as part of their project, also worked on alternative proteins and just won the University of Guelph's annual chili contest with their Feeding 9 Billion cricket chili. Our member of parliament says, interesting, add cloves and cinnamon to insect protein, yum. Sustainable food supply available anywhere, bugs. So, I think things are changing at the consumer end. And we can debate the positives and negatives of that, but there are opportunities. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit because I want to talk about three more opportunities that I think are quite interesting. And the first has to do with how we manage our supply chains. We have these incredibly complicated global food supply chains that link producers all over the world with people like you and me in North American and European cities. And 5 years ago, a whole lot of consumers woke up horrified at something that had happened in their supply chain. Horse meat found in Tesco's burgers. Well, this caused serious consideration over how we manage these supply chains. And the story here was that Eastern European horse racers had taken knackered racehorses and sold them off as beef into the supply chain that then got mixed into hamburgers that then got sold in Britain as processed food or prepared food. The horse in the horse meat was actually found using an interesting scientific technology called DNA barcoding. DNA barcoding was developed by the gentleman here on the left. He's a colleague at the University of Guelph. His name's Paul Hébert, and he's probably the most senior life scientist working in Canada today. DNA barcoding is a simple technology where you can take a tissue sample and you can run it through a reference library very inexpensively to figure out what's in it. And the scientist that actually did the DNA barcoding to identify the horse in the horse meat scandal is named Bob Hanner. He's the guy on the left of this slide, good friend and colleague. And finding this horse in the European horse meat scandal sort of launched Bob into an entire career as a sort of a food fraud forensic detective. And he's gone on to find horse meat in all sorts of stuff. He's found mislabeled stuff all over the place. And so the two other people in this photograph are two postdocs working in my lab, Ian Mosby in the middle and Sarah Rotz on the right. And we're working on a book on the future of food. And so we said, Bob, let's go eat sushi together. And let's talk about transparency in the food system. So we did, because one of the things that Bob has identified is that about a third of the seafood sold in North America is fraudulently mislabeled. And we took little baggies, like Ian's got here, of the sushi back to Bob's lab. And then we ran DNA barcoding analysis on the little baggies and discovered that zero of the tuna that we had been sold was actually tuna. None. It was an oily bycatch of the tuna industry called escolar, which is banned for consumption in Japan and Italy, amongst other countries, but not the US and Canada. Because for about 4 or 5% of consumers, it gives a very, very, very unpleasant experience in the bathroom the next day. So that's what we'd eaten. We'd eaten escolar, we hadn't eaten tuna fish. And you take tools like DNA barcoding and you add it to things like blockchain, which gets a lot of press, but essentially is just a fancy way of collecting data and making transactions transparent. And you take this sort of these different kinds of tools, and I think there is the opportunity to create a humongous amount of transparency in very obscure global food supply chains, such that in the future, technologies like blockchain and DNA barcoding will allow people like you and me to peer back through food supply chains and essentially sort of stare at the farmer or the fisher that produced the food. Another heavily disruptive area. The fourth area that I think things are going to change radically in is with the area of local and alternative. And here we're going to flip the conversation totally on its head, move away from technology, and actually acknowledge the fact that some of us, especially those of us who are wealthy, are going to look at these international supply systems and go, ugh, that's not the way I want it. I don't want to trust a DNA barcoded enabled blockchain system. I want to go talk to my farmer. No, thank you. And they're going to look at that Case International Harvester and say, there's only rural decay behind that tractor. I want to know the people that work in my food system. And they're going to look at these massive monocultures of commodities and say, no, my food system is going to be more diverse than that. And they're going to do things at least some of the week, perhaps not for every meal, perhaps not all the time, but they're going to intentionally and deliberately embrace an alternative model. And they're going to do things like buy my own personal favorite cider, the Duxbury cider, because it's good cider. It's not the best cider. It's not the cheapest cider, that's for certain. But it's produced just across from my grandparents' cottage. And I buy it because I like it. And you know, there's just something about the fact that I, throughout my whole life, have jogged up and down the Duxbury side road that makes me want to buy Duxbury cider, because it makes me feel good. It makes me feel connected. That doesn't mean that we're going to all eat local all of the time. First of all, it's expensive and typically is something that only wealthy people will enjoy. Secondly, it's not always environmentally beneficial to eat local. So while I think local is rising, we have to be critical of local as well. Imagine these 3 apples. Let's take one of them from Washington State, one of them from Ontario, and one of them from New Zealand. If you calculated all of the energy that goes into producing, shipping, and storing these 3 apples, and you say, I want to eat the least environmentally damaging apple, you would say, eat these 2, the Ontario and the Washington one, eat these 2 within 4 months of harvesting. But because if you're going to take it longer than that, you're going to probably have it in a refrigerator, and about 10% of the harvest is going to go bad. Actually, the New Zealand apple, if you're in Ontario, is better for the other 8 months of the year from an environmental perspective. And a tool called life cycle assessments has demonstrated again and again that there's a window where you want to eat local, and then the rest of the year you're actually better off going global in terms of your energy footprint. Nevertheless, while being contextual and critical, I think there's huge opportunities for growing the local food system. My final opportunity has to do with the youth and the next generation of farmers, the next generation. I'm going to call them agri-food thought leaders, because I don't think farmers is a big enough term for the people who are going to be producing, managing, processing, distributing, stewarding these complicated systems that we're in. And I think there's some really interesting issues going on here. And on one hand, the story may be kind of depressing. You may look at these Case International Harvesters with no cab on it, nowhere for a grandson to hang out with his grandfather, for instance. You may look at this technology that was developed by a colleague of mine. From an engineering perspective, it's freaking amazing. This arm that harvests these tomatoes, it has to recognize the right color of red to pick it. And then it's got to be able to grab the tomato and twist and pull at just the right amount. I mean, a human can do it instinctively, but doing that with a robot, I mean, there is a huge amount of very sophisticated robotics and artificial intelligence that goes into this. And there's nobody involved in it. There's the weeder of the future. Crazy little guys that run around your field and can distinguish between a weed and a corn crop. And there's the tractor swarm of the future. We're actually, I think, going to move away from big tractors and actually have lots of little network tractors. But this means this, I think. All these technologies mean this continued decline in our rural communities. But does it mean that the robot overlords are coming to destroy our world? Perhaps. but there's some powerful evidence to the contrary. For instance, I work at the University of Guelph, that's home to the Ontario Agricultural College. We recently published, last year, or 15 months ago, published a big report on the future of work in the sector. And the results of this report were revealing. There's actually 4 jobs for every one of our graduates. Very few sectors of the economy can boast 4 jobs for every graduate in the sector. Huge employment opportunities. Everything we did to survey this suggests that the gap between the number of people we graduate and employers' needs is expected to grow. So the labor gap is opening up. And every organization we surveyed suggests that there's going to be an increase in hires, not a decrease over the next 5 years. So at the same time as the robots are coming for the jobs, there are more new jobs actually being created. And this reflects something that actually is happening economy-wide. So Canada's largest bank, the Royal Bank of Canada, has investigated this issue quite seriously. Last spring, they put out this report called The Coming Skills Revolution Humans Wanted, How Canadian Youth Can Thrive in the Age of Disruption. And their conclusions were actually very similar to the ones I just listed off. According to the Royal Bank, a quarter of the jobs in Canada are going to be heavily disrupted by technology, yet the economy is expected to grow jobs over the next few years. But this is the kicker, this third point. There will be an increase in demand for foundational skills, such as critical thinking, coordination, social perceptiveness, active learning, and complex problem solving. Students need to be trained in ways that are in addition to their traditional STEM disciplines. So, let's bring humanities back into this conversation, shall we? I think we shall. So I think we talk about STEM, and then I've also heard STEAM, which adds arts into it. Maybe we go STEAM and put humanities in there. Maybe throw yoga in and go STEAMy. I don't know. I think there's a very, very strong need to empower youth explicitly to not only be good coders and good robot engineers, but also have this set of skills. And people like Gabby and I, who work with people who do robot coding and that sort of stuff, need to be stepping up and sort of going loud and going proud about what we're doing, because this is critical. So let me, with the last couple minutes, just quickly talk about an educational initiative that I run under the auspices of the Arrow Food Institute that I direct, and this Food from Thought research program. And building on what I just said about the need for these foundational skills, we fund students. I give out $2 million a year in scholarships to graduate students. And if they take my money, they work for me 1 day a week, in addition to their normal thesis work. And it's a course. They take a course with me, but it's a demanding course. And in that course, we do a lot of workshops. And we do workshops where we put students into teams, and we have those teams linked up with community partners, which might be an ag company or a food bank. And those students work on a project with that community partner for 8 months. And they're assessed based on the learning contract that we build out at the beginning of that 8 months. But then, as we're going along, we do media training, communication studies. We do workshops on conflict resolution, workshops on active listening, how to send off good body language in a group. Bringing all of these foundational things out of the sort of implicit skill set and making them explicit, actually putting them formally into the curriculum. And it's fun. We have a good time, and we're showing good success. So here's one of our groups from last year. The 4 women in here decided they wanted to tackle 2 problems: school nutrition and food waste. So 2 of them worked with our business incubator program and built up a business plan for how to use carrots and potatoes and apples that would otherwise not be sold, and turn them into a product that could then be used in school lunch programs. And the other 3 were food scientists, and they actually worked with the potatoes, carrots, and apples to create a product out of them in our food science lab. And we had this great opportunity. So when that Royal Bank skills report was released a couple months ago, we were actually brought on stage to help the Royal Bank launch the skills report. And so there's myself and Leah and Amberly being interviewed by one of the most senior Canadian journalists active right now. His name's John Stackhouse, about this experience. if anybody's interested, there was a podcast about our experience in building this educational program up. So with that being said, I'm going to quickly summarize and open the floor to questions. I feel very serious that we today sit at a very uncertain moment in history, and it's easy to get kind of pessimistic about things. The issues like those food riots that I talked about at the beginning of my lecture, the enormous amount of waste, and it really does feel like aspects of our economy, our food system, are going to go into a terminal decline. At the same time, I have a high level of optimism that there are huge opportunities in the broad area of precision agriculture, alternative proteins, supply chain and transparency that will allow sectors of the economy to grow a lot. And I think they really will grow. So while parts of the food system I think are going to decline, and in particular, and I say this with full respect for my friends and colleagues that work in the livestock industry, I really do think the traditional livestock industry is in for a tough 20 or 30 years. I think that the farmers that embrace the technology will do quite well. But how we navigate that, how we do that in a way that doesn't destroy rural communities, that doesn't disenfranchise people, is the real challenge. And then I think there's also going to be significant growth, probably not the same level of growth, but significant growth in that alternative and local movement, where those of us who can afford a different style of food will at least sometimes in the week, Friday night dinner when friends are coming over, for instance, very much embrace that alternative model. And I guess if I had to put everything down into a single statement, I think that if we imagine jumping forward to the beginning of the 22nd century, 100 years from now, there will be history books written about the 21st century, and there will be big chapters in those history books about food and food security. I do think that disruptive technology and social equity will play major themes in that. And I'm going to end with a sense of optimism that I think that chapter, hypothetical chapter about our food over this century, will have more good news than bad news in it. It won't be perfect. It won't be an unmitigated success. We won't hit nirvana of a perfect food system, but we will have a better food system in the future. At least that's my belief. So with that being said, I'm going to say, that's me. You can track me down pretty easily if you want to follow up with questions. And right now, I think we've got the room for another 20 minutes, half an hour, so I'm happy to engage in debate right now. Thank you. I'm happy to navigate questions, yeah. Gentleman at the back, and then you, and then we'll come down to you.
So in the category of local produce growing, what about role urban gardens, getting it so local that we're not just going to a nearby CSA or farmer's market, but actually getting folks to go back. Similar to the time of during World War II, when everybody go to a Liberty Garden to produce their own food.
So it's a great point, and the issue of, or the opportunity, the potential of urban food production, I think is huge. I got really excited about this a few years ago and had a master's student focus exactly on this issue. And what he did was I thought was kind of clever. He identified a fairly large sample of gardeners and handed out garden diaries. And he tracked all the money they spent, all the land they used, all the labor they put in hours, and then all the food they got out of it. And there was sort of one big lesson, which is kind of a depressing one, but then a small lesson, which is actually quite optimistic. The big lesson is, for all the effort, you ended up with a few very expensive salads. And it was, I mean, we're talking $80, $100 per serving salads by the time you added up all the stuff people had bought for their gardens and divided it by, and all the time they spent, and even accounting for like zero wage of labor, you ended up with just ridiculously expensive lettuce. So that was kind of depressing, right? But the positive side was that about 5% of the gardeners we surveyed were unbelievably productive. They were our grandparents, or my grandparents, with the Victory Gardens. They were really good gardeners. And they produced, the conclusion that Mike drew from this research was that it's a viable strategy if we can bridge the skills gap. And to a large extent, we've lost, as a society, we've lost those skills. So, yes, if we can bridge the skills gap, and if we can swap gardening for golf or something like that, to be a little trite and not to beat up, I don't golf, so it's easy for me to pick on golfers. But if we can swap gardening for golf as sort of a cultural pastime and rebuild those skills, then yeah, I think we can. But if we keep golfing or other stuff, then we won't develop the skills, because it'll take quite a few years to get that skill set back to where we need it to be a serious food production strategy. Sorry, I'm going to come to you first, and then I'll come to you, okay? I saw your hand a minute ago.
Yeah, I'm still lost in how horse meat, if the story is true, how that would happen, and how, say, blockchain or something would make things a lot more honest and less prone to error.
So the story is true. There was horse meat in the European horse system, and Bob has gone on and found horse meat in Canadian sausages. So it is there, and if Bob were here, he would say that the more they look for it, the more they find evidence of fraud. So the seafood study was really interesting because they found that 1/3 of the products sold, and this was across North America as I recall, 1/3 of the products sold contained ingredients not on the label, and 100% of those were the ingredient that was on the label was economically inferior to what was on the label. So this wasn't by accident. This was intentional fraud. So yes, it is true. I say that with a high level of certainty. How would blockchain help? Well, blockchain on its own won't help. Blockchain is a system for allowing transparency in transactions. So what we're doing, for instance, I've got a pilot project we're trying to get off the ground right now. Walmart has done this with their mango system just in the last year. What they're doing is they're saying, if you want to sell to Walmart, or the one that I'm working on is soybeans, if you want to sell on this particular soybean system, you have to upload your data into a closed blockchain, which would essentially mean that all the transactions from a grower to a dryer, from a dryer to a processor, from a processor to a distributor, all those things would have to be entered into the blockchain so everybody could see what change happened, when it happened, and then you would have them inspected at certain times. And when you add biotracers like DNA barcoding as an input into a blockchain, spot inspections on that system, and then you upload everything into the blockchain, you then start moving towards having transparency, as opposed to right now where we're like, I have no idea where this fish came from, somewhere in China at some point in the last 3 months. And that's where we're at right now. So, there you go. That would be but that's a long way off. Yourself, yeah.
So my question is, what are your thoughts about agroecology in all this? Maybe you touched on it a little bit when you said building skills. I don't know if that's what you meant.
So the question is, what do I think about agroecology? So agroecology, I'll start with my definition of agroecology, so at least we know what we're talking about. For me, agroecology would be an approach to farming that generally favors relatively small-scale farming, but very, very attentive to things like microclimates and making sure that what you're doing in this particular patch is suited to what's being done in this patch, and how you might farm this patch might be quite different than how you farm this patch, because you're being very mindful of the agroecological conditions. So if this is a little bit sandier or better drained, you might plant a different crop in it than this area that might be a little more clay-based. So I think there's a tremendous amount of potential in that. Certainly some of the most productive, innovative farmers in the world are using those sort of principles. I don't think that, but I also think that at any scale of farming, you can become more mindful of the ecological constraints. So even if you're a farmer with 20,000 hectares under cultivation in, say, Missouri, you can learn something about the ecology that you're farming in and adopt your practices better. And I think in some ways, these wave of smart tractors that are coming on will allow for greater awareness of, or greater inclusion of agroecological principles at the very large scale. they probably will take humans even more out of the equation than they already are. But I think we will always be learning from ecological scale. The Green Revolution, which is the development of fertilizers and pesticides and hybridized seeds, sort of defines agriculture in the 20th century. And it's a set of technologies that allow farmers to essentially do the same management practices over huge, huge areas. My hope, I could be naive, and there's trade-offs, so those are two very important caveats. My hope is that precision agricultural technologies will allow farmers to go back to a much smaller scale of management, where they can manage at a much smaller scale, being aware of soil conditions and how soil conditions change, and not just have a one-size-fits-all approach to farming. But there's trade-offs, which we can talk about. Other questions? Yourself, yeah.
So you talk about outdoor agriculture, the traditional type, but like in the Netherlands, they have food towers. I forget what they're called. But
Vertical
they're
farms?
buildings, right?
Vertical farms?
That's it.
Yep.
Yeah. Where the lettuce never touches the soil.
Yep.
And it cuts down on pesticides, for instance. And
Yep.
everything is controlled from micro samples. How does that offer us hope?
So
Or why did you not talk about it?
So vertical farming is catching on. There's a new vertical farm about 3 kilometers from my house. It is a marvel of technology. It's 60,000 square feet. It produces lettuce and basil and spinach at a high level. It's almost depends how you define organic. It certainly is using no pesticides because it's in a hermetically sealed box. It also uses almost no humans. Robots plant, basically a little arm comes along and drops the seed into the growth medium, and then the tray slowly is raised and moved across the lights. It's all LED lit. And then at the end of this 21 days, a blade comes along and cuts the leaves off, and they fall onto a conveyor belt, are lightly washed, and are packaged. It's quite amazing, right? Like it really is. Where we're at with that particular technology is green leafy vegetables. We can do it for basil, we can do it for Swiss chard, we can do it for all those sort of products. A food system is not built on salad. Salad's great.
Tomatoes, too.
Some places are doing tomatoes. Tomatoes are just beginning, but the LED light, the really true vertical farms where you're actually using LED lights, not sunlight, the tomato varieties, they haven't figured out how to do tomatoes under LED lights. So you're doing tomatoes highly intensively in greenhouses, yes, and that's well established. My point is that almost all the crops that we're doing in this way are ones where the value per square meter is very, very high. And it's not grains and it's not proteins. So the main components of our diet are carbohydrate and protein. And I haven't yet seen a system that's like that would do carbohydrate or protein in a sufficient volume for like a city of 10 million people. Those systems, carbohydrates and proteins, are so expansive that I think, as far as I know, they will be outside for a long, long time. But I think there's going to be a great market. There already is a great market for very, very high quality, but generally quite expensive green leafy vegetables. Maybe we'll get cucumbers and tomatoes into the mix. It's basically salads, and we'll do those in these vertical farms. And there will be lots of great job opportunities. And it's not a food security strategy. It's a great salad. Yeah.
When you're speaking, where are you in terms of like your framework? Where are you putting lentils, chickpeas, kanuki beans, quinoa?
Yeah. So
putting those in grains?
No, it's proteins.
So when you talk about alternative proteins, that's where you're putting those.
Absolutely. So the Light Life burger, the benevolent bacon, all those are lentil-based or pulse-based products.
I'm just wondering, like I'm thinking about the folks that are doing the alternative proteins, like the insect-based, which in other cultures around the world they've used it for all time. Are those folks going down that road because they feel like in sort of a westernized or in North America framework that the meat eaters of the world would rather eat a bug than eat like a chickpea because they feel like that's going to be a more complete protein? Or I'm just curious
Yeah, it's a good question.
how
So-
they're making that jump.
So Sarah and Ian, the two postdocs I mentioned, and I have been writing this book. And one of the chapters is on alternative proteins. And we ate all the different alternative proteins we could find. And ultimately what we decided was a good vegetarian dish was probably tastier, cheaper, and easier to do than any of these gee whiz alternative proteins. Like even the best alternative burger, the Impossible Burger, for instance. It was fine, but it wasn't a great burger. Like if I'm gonna have a burger, I want a burger.
And speaking as somebody who's a vegetarian and vegan, I don't want my burger to bleed.
Yeah.
I don't need to have my burger like having this fake blood coming out because that's why I'm not a eater.
Yeah. So the point that just for everyone's information, there's a product in our blood that binds with iron, and it comes under different names, but hema, it's got a hema kind of prefix. You can find the same kind of chemical in soybeans and in beets. And so this Impossible Burger that is being marketed now has used the same hema product, but a plant-based one, and they've infused that into a plant-based burger to give it that sizzle, that snap, and that red color. It's fine, but I think you're right. I think for true vegetarian people, it will be insufficient because you're not looking for a meat substitute. You're looking for a good vegetarian meal. I think where I think this is going to go is I think blended products. I think the Impossible Burger itself won't be particularly successful. However, if you move the Impossible Burger and you cut it with some beef, you will drop the content of beef down. You'll use an increasingly blended product, and you'll reduce the environmental footprint of conventional products. And I think that's where the Maple Leafs and the Tysons and the Nestle's are going to go with this. That's my prediction anyways.
Yeah, it seems like that would be a good stepping stone.
Hey, I mean, that's the trajectory my own family's on. You know, we used to make chili with beef, and then we started mixing refried beans and veggie mince with beef, and now we're basically just making it with veggie mince and refried beans. And so there was a 2 or 3 year period of transition. So I think that's the sort of arc that's the most likely that we're talking about, where the majority of the alternative proteins come out of a soybean or a lentil or a chickpea.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Yeah.
Pittsburgh is an interesting city in the sense that we have a farmer's market every day of the week
Cool.
here. And a lot of them are located in parts of the city where there is some food insecurity. And so I wonder and they do accept food stamps as well. So I wonder if, I don't know how common that is, and in what you're talking about, the eating local, buying from farmers markets, is something that the wealthy do. Is Pittsburgh an anomaly in that way, in the sense that you do see a varied demographic, not super varied, but there's some variance?
So I don't know the situation in Pittsburgh. What you're describing seems unusual to me based on my experience or my observation. In Canada, there is a food bank-like organization called the Community Food Centres Canada, which has tried relatively unsuccessfully in providing farmers market products in a food insecure environment. The one example, which I'm actually quite proud of because it was started by a couple of former students of mine, that seems to be successful is in Guelph, and they have a pay what you can farmers market where they have a sliding scale. So I was there a couple weeks ago and I picked up a spaghetti swash that was 50 cents to $3, and they said, we would like you to pay 50 cents to $3. We don't care which one you pay, you're going to have to tell us. And they are doing pretty well, right? So there's enough people like me paying $3 that the system runs, giving lots of people access to the spaghetti squash for 50 cents. So for me, that was the most interesting model, but maybe Pittsburgh's onto something that I'm not aware of. That would be great. Gentlemen,
Just a quick follow on there.
Yeah, please.
That actually program just launched for Pittsburgh that gives folks that are using food stamps or that money a bonus if they spend money at the farmer's market, they get extra money back. So there's a program to try to create some incentive, but I will say it's probably somewhat marginal in terms of bringing people in.
Yeah, so that was
But it has a promise.
I had another master's student, actually the one that set up, master's student of mine that ultimately set up that pay what you can market, evaluated this NGO running this sort of, attempting to bring farmers markets into sort of food bank environments, and it really didn't work. Yeah, there was all sorts of social stigmas associated with it, but then the cost point was just uneconomical. There was a hand over here. Yeah.
Could you go back to that slide, not literally, but to expand on the discussion of how the price of oil, or the production of oil, and that one that you just dropped in there, would you be able to talk about that? And
Yeah, well, let's
the needle?
let's have a discussion about that. There is at least since 2008, there has been a very, very strong correlation between international energy prices, such as US dollars per barrel for oil, and international food prices. So why might that be? Happy to debate. I think there's a couple of obvious things. One, energy is a primary input into producing fertilizers and pesticides, and certainly the gas the farmer buys to drive the tractor or the combine across the field. So there's that. I think that goes part of the way. I think there's also an international financial argument here. And in about 2005, Goldman Sachs and a couple of the other big banks started creating investment products where they were simultaneously investing in a whole range of commodities at the same time as a hedge against inflation. So this is when the tech prices were going crazy, the stock market was collapsing, the subprime mortgage crisis happened in the US and then in Britain. And a lot of the big financial organizations started betting on commodities. And so they would create, and this is sort of like big investment funds that pension plans would be buying into, right? So, the investment at the biggest possible scale, we're buying commodities funds. And that would include food futures and oil futures together. And so I think at a financial level, you started seeing some instruments that bolted the two systems or the two sectors of the economy together, so that when one price rose, the other rose, because it was all part of the same set of financial products that big banks were selling to big investors. So I think there's probably two things going on. But it's a bit perplexing. Like, why? It's there, it's real, the evidence is clear, but why exactly is it happening? Don't know.
Could you talk about how your center uses games and comic books to get your message across?
Sure. So so for those of you at the back that maybe couldn't hear, the question was from Jim, and it was how we're using games and comic books and things like that to talk about these things. There's a personal reason and a pedagogical reason. I'll start with the personal one. The personal reason is I, about 10 years ago, wrote these two books, and they were well received critically and were commercially nothing. Dropped off the face of the earth. And I remember about 8 years ago being very frustrated that my book that was going to be the next Omnivore's Dilemma, the next big thing, simply wasn't. And I was standing on an airplane, and everybody had a device and was playing a video game in this airplane, and almost nobody had a book in their lap. And I thought, oh boy, I'm using yesterday's medium. If I want to be relevant, I better get with the program and do something that's a little bit more relevant. So that's sort of the personal reason. I started, out of a sense of frustration with my books, I started investigating other things to do. But there's a strong pedagogical rationale going on here as well. I think we live in short format, an age of history which is short format, oral and visual. And so I think we have to, as communicators, we need to be going short format, oral and visual, as opposed to long format and text-based. Also, I have a strong sense that the power of a good story well told is more rememberable, more engaging than any number of graphs and charts. And so there's a strong sense that, that the use of story and metaphor in communication is a very powerful tool, especially if you back it up with a little bit of data. So I try to tell a story, show a bit of data, tell a story, show a little bit of data. And that actually becomes a very memorable experience, so people retain that sort of information quite often better. So that's a second, another reason. And then the final reason is an effort just to simply engage people. So the game is designed to be fun. It's a card game, it's fun, you can play it, it's easy to play, but then you have to ask the question. So the teacher then says, right, you just played this game, this card game, it talked about genetic modification. Go and write me an essay on genetic modification. So it becomes a hook into these bigger issues that the teacher can then springboard off of into the subject, into the topic, and it gives people a very personal way of relating back to things that they might not otherwise be able to relate back to. Those are my three reasons. But really, I was just kind of grumpy because my books didn't sell.
Yeah, but I have a question. So when you showed that chart, so I'm probably one of the only nerds that actually remembers the chart.
That's okay.
The chart where you were showing the number of calories and was it the price index, the blue line, right?
Yep.
And you had like those two markers, the 2600 and the 2850 for the lines of the caloric intake. Do you know if anyone or, and if not, maybe this would be an interesting challenge in the future, which is, would you put a line on there that would show the population of people that were and currently now are living in food deserts and or food swamps? I wonder if that would be an interesting thing to add to the visual, just kind of showing how people may have gotten away from
That's interesting.
proximity to their food, or the way that, and maybe that is probably not what it would show. It might show the way that people have migrated into urban core centers that are farther away from farming, like farming.
Yeah, because we're dealing with global statistics here, I think the food swamps, food deserts thing just wouldn't show up. But certainly you could put urban, percentage of population urban.
Yeah.
And
or it might be an interesting
it
one
would
to
be
do
doing
for,
this.
Yeah, to do for like a, areas that do have such a thing, that they talk about and kind of do that data to see. I'd be intrigued to see what would happen with the line.
Yeah, all right.
Keep me posted.
I don't know. Sounds good. Gabby.
Could you say a little bit more about food distribution? So, this also says clearly, what you said is that we have enough food to go around. And you give a lot of opportunities. How do you see food distribution in the future when it comes to food insecure people? So, all of these technologies are great, but if they're not reaching the right people, so are you optimistic about that?
So food distribution is a really hard one to wrap your head around. I'll go back to the Hungry Planet, the Revis family versus the Notomos family. We can't take the hamburgers away from the Revis family and give them to the Notomos family. On so many levels that doesn't work. So direct redistribution never works except as emergency food aid in dire circumstances to stave off a calamity. So World Food Program does good work distributing food to people in crisis. The Food Bank Motion movement does that. But really, direct distribution or direct redistribution is a very hard one to wrap your heads around. It has been tried in the past and done badly. Often it results in, or in the 70s and 80s, it resulted in shiploads of American and Canadian grain being dumped into markets in Africa to go from a have to a have-not context, and simply depressed agricultural prices in the developing world of the global south and caused worse problems than it ever solved. So while intuitively we have this sense that we've got too much in one part of the world, not enough in another, it should be an easy one to solve through distribution, I've yet to see a mechanism to actually do redistribution that makes sense. The only way that I can wrap my head around this isn't to say direct redistribution, but to reduce poverty and grow demand in the impoverished parts of the world or amongst impoverished communities. And so in places like Canada or the US, for me, this talks to raising minimum wages and guaranteed living wages and those kind of debates as the only way I can imagine coming at this issue. And in Africa, for instance, it would be about growing markets and working, say, with at issues of gender, because we haven't talked about gender, but disproportionately it's women that are facing food insecurity, and so there has to be ways of empowering marginalized groups in order to demand more. So, redistribution sounds great, but I've never really seen it done well.
So it's going to be a policy issue, but do you feel like this is going to happen? Because I mean, there's so many different problems involved, right? So the way that we export to these countries so that their markets are being depressed. So are you hopeful when it comes to that?
So we don't really do much of that anymore. Most of the international agricultural trade is done now, isn't that sort of dumping model of the 1970s and 80s where USAID or the Canadian International Development Agency simply took stuff that the farmers in Canada couldn't sold and just sort of took it to Ethiopia and kind of said, right, there you go. Here's 17,000 tons of wheat. Not sure what you're going to do with it. I mean, luckily we're not really doing that anymore. We have learned that lesson. So that's good. I mean, I don't have any problem with Canadian farmers selling wheat to China. That's probably quite rational, to be honest. But your question was more along the lines of, are we going to? So I think the real question that you're asking, Gabby, is, am I optimistic that we are going to work on inequality and poverty and guaranteed minimum wage or guaranteed living wage type things? And I'm not going to answer that because that's the pessimist versus the optimist. I think we should be working towards that and seeking whatever levers we can find with our policymakers to work towards that. And hopefully, in some parts of the world, we will achieve that. It won't be perfect, of course. Yeah.
I wonder if there's any impetus to make the definition of food insecurity a more widely understood phenomenon, because I feel like a lot of people have this idea that food insecurity means that there is no food, but that's not necessarily the same thing, right? And so an issue in Pittsburgh is that there are a lot of food deserts, so there are a lot of people who don't have access to healthy food, or it's all processed food, or no food at all. And so I think if more people understood that, maybe there would be more of a conversation.
Yep.
And
Sounds great.
Do you have any ideas to why that's not?
Well, it's not for lack of trying on my part anyways. So yeah, clearly I think, because I flew here today to talk to you about this, clearly I think having a conversation about food is a good thing to do. And getting into food security is a vital issue. I'll be honest, I'm optimistic that even in the last 6 to 12 years, there is far more awareness, at least I'm perceiving far more awareness of these issues than before. Certainly I think the 2008 price spike was a bit of a watershed moment, and that guy who I mentioned earlier in my talk, the chief scientist for the British government, I mean in 2008 he gave what's known now as the perfect storm speech, and that was, I mean I'd never heard food security being discussed by a chief scientist anywhere, let alone Britain's chief scientist, saying this is one of the major issues facing the world. And since then, with regularity, we've got very, very senior people weighing in on this issue. Of course, not perfectly and not seamlessly and whatnot, but in the circles that I travel, there is a much higher level of awareness amongst policymakers and practitioners about these issues than in the past. So I feel like we're getting somewhere, but yeah. Again, like Gabby, this is sort of an optimistic versus pessimistic kind of a question you're asking. Am I optimistic we're getting somewhere? Yeah, I think we're getting somewhere. Do we need to go more? Yes. Another question, and then we're going to wrap up, I think. Last question? Gabby's one more? Okay, last question.
Comparing, say, local farmers markets to the things happening with appeal sciences with the longevity in terms of materials that you can like coat your fruit with and then ship it for longer and stuff. Do you see that being maybe more significant in terms of the scale and impact people? Or disruptive?
Well, I mean, you know, a mentor of mine always says if you're presented with two choices, a hexanol spray that means my soft fruit lasts for 2 weeks instead of 2 days before it gets to me, and the farmer's market. I mean, maybe I don't have to choose between them, right? The world's a big place, and you know, we talk about food as if it's a thing. It's actually millions of things. We talk about consumers as if they're a thing, but there is no consumer. So I actually think there's space for a lot of these things. And I don't think that deciding between food systems or choices is necessarily as much of a zero-sum game as we sometimes describe when we talk about these issues. I think a large number of these systems can, to some extent, cohabit. And yeah, I've got a grad student who's working on hexanol sprays to reduce spoilage rates in soft fruit, and she's doing great work from a food chemistry perspective. And these hexanol sprays, you know, as far as anybody can see, are extremely inert. You know, it seems to be from a chemical perspective, a very good piece of technology that will reduce, if utilized, say, in the peaches of Ontario, it'll reduce wastage enormously. And I also think we should be going to farmers markets. Yeah. All right, I'm running out of steam here. I've been up since 4 o'clock.
Okay, thank you very much for coming, everyone. And I guess there's a lot to